March edition of Aletheia this year. Do we have any Star Trek fans here? Just raise a hand if you're a Star Trek fan. Oh, well, that's disappointing. Okay, my opening quote was from Star Trek, so I think it'll be lost on most people. That venerable Vulcan philosopher, Mr. Spock, said, no excuses. He said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That's right. And I wonder if that's how you think, because actually in modern life you could be excused for thinking otherwise, with the focus in modern Western culture on the individual freedoms, individual rights, individual welfare, all those kinds of things. So where do we find the balance between the needs of the many and the needs of the few or the one? How, as Christians, are we to think about this? Are we meant to think of ourselves first and foremost as a community, or is the individual the image of God and the most important thing? To lead us through this fascinating topic today, we welcome Albert Baky. Thank you very much.
Hello. Can you hear me fine? Or yeah? No? Yes? Can you hear me fine now? No? Yes? Okay. So today the topic will be on community and individualism. So if anyone's interested, this image here is actually like a miniature from a manuscript by a mystic, a Western mystic called Hildegard. I think she was German, I'm not sure, but essentially what it is it shows the heavenly hosts as they're circling around God. So that point in the center is God, and then you have the 9 levels of the heavenly hosts. So before I start, I sort of wanted to position ourselves to see what it is that we're actually talking about. So I wanted to ask a few questions. I want you guys to raise your hands up if this applies to you. So the first question is, who here feels that he or she is a unique individual and that there is no one else like them in the world? So put your hand up. See, yeah, most of you guys. Okay, secondly, who has felt that because you belong to a community like a church or a school or a university, you feel like it's very easy to lose your identity? So who's felt like they've had to sort of conform and change their identity because they belong to school? Anyone? Anyone? Just one? Yeah. So secondly, who has felt that in order to try and preserve this identity, it has often meant that you feel very lonely and isolated as well? Yeah. So this is essentially what I want to talk about, this sort of dichotomy between the individual and the collective, and how it's really hard to try and balance those two things. So essentially what I want to talk about for now is individualism and collectivism. So as Abuna mentioned, it's this idea of the needs of the few versus the needs of the many, or the needs of the one versus the many. So in the first picture, again, you can see just one figure versus many. And then in the picture below, one part of individualism is that everyone's expected to have their own opinion, whereas with collectivism, you sort of have a united front, like everyone shares that same opinion. So this sort of dichotomy between individualism and collectivism is sort of everywhere. So you get this sort of thing in culture as well. So you have on your left, a man saying you must learn to think for yourself. And of course, this is supposed to represent the American idea of individualism. You're supposed to stand on your own 2 feet. The whole, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And then on the other side, you have sort of the Eastern, Asian sort of idea of the collective. So you must always do what is best for your own family. So you have to sort of sacrifice your own needs and desires for the good of the greater whole. You also get this dichotomy in politics. So on your left, you have sort of like the typical depiction of like consumerism, capitalism, and then on your right, you have a poster from, I think, International Workers' Day, so it's a communist poster. Again, it's supposed to show the individual versus the many. And then you also have this in religion. So I think this book and the title is a perfect example, The Power of I Am. It's sort of taking the name of God, I am, and sort of usurping it and saying that I can become my own God, essentially. And then on the other side, you have a mass wedding ceremony from the Unification Church. So it's a church that started in South Korea. And they think that if you live a good life and then you have kids, your kids will take over the world. And that's essentially what Christianity was meant to be about. But here again, I'm trying to show this comparison between the individual and the collective. So having that in mind, this is what I hope to do. So these are the 3 points. I probably am not going to answer them. I just want to give you guys ideas to try and grapple with and digest and think for yourselves. So the first thing is that Christianity as pure and undefiled religion is not comparable to a cult that forces you to conform, nor is it a sort of belief system where you just sort of become a Christian so you can help yourself. It's not that sort of thing. Secondly, individualism and collectivism, as I've described it, it's a false dichotomy. So in Christianity, we are neither individualistic or collectivist. And if you try and apply these things, you sort of end up running into major problems. And then the last one is something that I'm definitely not going to explain adequately, and that is that the Trinity is the social model for us as Christians, and that this Trinity was revealed to us through Christ and through the church. So I want to start on the first point. So again, I have this picture. I'm not bagging out Catholics. It's just a really cool picture to sort of like express this point. So the question is Christianity a cult? Is it sort of this collectivist organization where you have to conform? And then when you think about it, it seems far-fetched, but then you start listing what is central to Christianity, and it seems like we are almost cultic. So the first thing is dogma. So you have to believe certain things, otherwise you're declared a heretic. And then we have morals. You have to act in a particular way, otherwise you are considered an evil sinner and you are shunned. And then there's a hierarchy as well. If you don't submit to this hierarchy, then again you are kicked out because you are being insubordinate. And the last one is they persecute dissidents. So they persecute individuals. They burn them at the stake. So the Orthodox have done that as well in Russia. A lot of religions have persecuted people who have tried to think for themselves and that sort of thing. So it does seem like we're sort of a collectivist society where we're supposed to conform. And if you think that this does not properly depict us, even St. Paul said this. He said, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. And he also said, for as many of you have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. And I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So here it seems to very clearly say that I almost have to relinquish my identity and be like Christ. So, of course, we would agree with this, but not in the sort of collectivist understanding where we have to sort of give our identity and be carbon copies of one another. And so as a sort of backlash to this collectivism, you sort of get this, and I know this isn't a Christian picture, but it sort of depicts it perfectly. So there you have the religious the collection, they're all conforming to one another, and then you have this one individual who's standing up against the sort of the herd mentality and wants to be a free thinker. And so this has become a very central part of humanity, of Western modern culture. So this is a man, he's a philosopher called Max Stirner, and he was an existentialist, and existentialists like to emphasize the individual. So essentially what he said was, and this sums up the sort of mindset of Western culture or modern culture, to be a man is not to realize the ideal of man, but to present oneself the individual. I am my species. I am without norm, without law, without model, and the like. It is possible that I can make very little out of myself, but this little is everything, and it is better that I allow to be made out of me by the might of others, by the training of custom, religion, the laws, the state. So this is sort of pure individualism distilled to its purest state, where he reacts against anything that will cause him to conform. So it includes religion, the state, laws, or absolutely anything. Now, the thing is, this dichotomy is false and it's dangerous. And C.S. Lewis very succinctly sort of explains why it is we can't sort of jump between these two polar opposites. So it's a lot of text. I'll just read it out for you guys. So he says in Mere Christianity, and he's talking about this idea of collectivism and individualism as well. He's saying, I feel a strong desire to tell you, and I expect you feel a strong desire to tell me, which of these two errors is the worse. That is the devil getting at us. He always sends errors into the world in pairs of opposites, and he always encourages us to spend a lot of time thinking which is the worse. You see, why, of course? He relies on your extra dislike of the one error to draw you gradually into the opposite one. But do not let us be fooled. We have to keep our eyes on the goal and go straight through between both errors. We have no other concern than that with either of them. So essentially what he's saying is we cannot sort of make it a either or, because it's a false dichotomy. You're not either an individualist or a collectivist. So he's saying we have to find another solution. So what exactly is the solution? Sort of we're left with either conform or be an individual and not belong to anything. So I would like to start from the beginning, so to speak, and sort of try and figure out what it means to be man. So when we talk about the nature of man, I'll just mention a few secular ideas and scientific ideas. So Aristotle said, without friends, no one would choose to live, though he had all other goods. So this seems really extreme. He's saying that if we had water, food, shelter, all of that, it would not be worth living unless we had people to relate to. So he's emphasizing the importance of being able to relate to others. And another point is that whenever someone says that they are a self-made man, they're talking nonsense, because from the moment you are born, you rely on the charity of others. If you did not have your mother, you would just perish. So from the very beginning, man is reliant upon others in order to grow and to be nurtured. And the last one is a bit contentious, but I found it really interesting, is that scientists have found that we have mirror neurons. So these are neurons that fire in your head when you perform an action and when someone else performs a similar action. So it seems like we're even hardwired to be able to relate to others. And to show a really interesting example of why connection, human interaction is really important, do you guys remember this serial killer who massacred about 70 children or so, 77 people in Norway? So he was in solitary confinement. And if you read the third paragraph, it says he was in a 3-cell complex. He could play video games, watch TV, and exercise. But a court found that this was inhuman treatment. And the reason was that the solitary confinement went against his human rights. So even in secular society, we find that human interaction, human contact is essential to our well-being. So that is sort of the secular understanding. Now moving on to why we as Christians would believe we need to live in a community, or how we should exist or relate to ourselves and to others. So, and to do this, I'm going to go all the way back to Genesis. So during the creation story, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And now you'll see that I underlined and made bold us, our, and our likeness. And this is to emphasize that God exists as Trinity. So he exists as community. So to be made in the image of God means to require community. And then the second one is, and the Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone." And having said that, he created Eve so that we could have a companion. And the interesting thing is, this is the first time that God actually says it is not good. So everything before that was good, but it was now when he recognized that one of his creation was isolated, that he said it was not good, and he went about to try and fix that. So here is where I want to introduce our model of what it means to be human, to relate to ourselves and to relate to others. So the Trinity, and again, I'm not going to pretend to know what I'm talking about here or explain it. It's the Trinity, it's a mystery. So the point is here that it is not individualism that we should pursue, but personhood. And it is not collectivism, but community. So what these things mean are, personhood means I need to relate to others. So person, I think it's related to the Greek prosopon or persona in Latin, and it just means that I must face another. So you cannot exist as a person unless there is another person to face. An individual exists wholly alone. They're completely isolated. And again, the collectivism, we do not agree with collectivism, but we think that we need community. And community means to be united together. It is not to conform, not to lose our identity, not to become just sort of an amorphous whole. And whereas the Western world would say, I think, therefore I am, so that is sort of the line of philosophy, we would say that you are, therefore I am. So that is how we as Christians would think about it. So having said that, I just want to talk about then what happens when we sort of apply collectivism or individualism to Christianity, because as I said, things start to go wrong. So the first example is this. So many of you might have heard, that all you need to become a Christian is to say that I accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. So this is actually a very, very modern invention, this sinner's prayer. And the thing is, all we have to do is look at the most iconic conversion in the New Testament, and that of St. Paul. So when St. Paul was struck by that light and he heard a voice speaking to him, he had direct perception of God, and yet he didn't go run off and make his own church, his own community. He instead went to, he sought so God said, go to the city and seek someone. And then he found Ananias, and then he was baptized for him. So his conversion was communal in that he sought out others. It was ascetical, so he fasted again, and it was sacramental in that, again, being part of the church, he was offered baptism. So this is something that can only happen if there's a sort of institution that exists. Now, in place of that, and I had to look this up because it's real, and I'm not mocking him, it was just too good to pass up. But essentially what he said is, you don't need to go to church to be a Christian. If you go to Taco Bell, that doesn't make you a taco. So I had to look that up just to make sure, but he actually said that in an interview. So this sums up the individualistic Christianity of our day. And before that, he spoke about how you don't have to go to church. It's okay to be like an individual Christian, to have a personal relationship with God. And the problem with this is it's very dangerous. And essentially what it is a denial of, to use an analogy, it would be as if you had the first physician in the world come and establish a hospital. So he is a doctor who has taught us all things, how to treat illnesses, how to treat sickness. Now all of us being sick would like to enter this hospital, right? But essentially this sort of ideology says, all I need to do is Google my illness and then perhaps get surgery kit on eBay and then try and perform it myself. So that is essentially what is happening when you say, all I need to do is commit myself to Christ and then I can go out alone. Now, and the problem with this is in modern times, you sort of see the end result, the logical conclusion of this. And this is how you get the whole idea of being spiritual but not religious. So the whole emphasis here is I am my own individual. I don't want to lose my identity. I don't want to have to listen to others. I want to forge my own path. So and that picture sums it up perfectly. Religion is belief in someone else's experience. Spirituality is having your own experience. So this is the whole sort of motto of the New Age movement. They're just sick of organized religion and they want to go at it alone. And that quote there might seem like it doesn't apply. So it's from the Rule of Saint Benedict, which is a sort of set of rules or codes for communal life in a monastery. And they were based on those written by, I think, Saint Pachomius as well. So essentially, what he's going through a list of monks, and this is what he says: but the fourth class of monks keep going their whole life long from one province to another, staying 3 or 4 days at a time in different cells as guests, always roving and never settled. They indulge their passions and the cravings of their appetites. It is better to pass all these over in silence than to speak of their most wretched life. So the thing is, the reason I put this here is they pretty much mirror that individual seeker of religion nowadays. That monk is someone who, when the going gets tough, when they have to sort of change who they are, when they sort of have to pray a little harder, or when they have to do something they don't like, they just move on. And this is the same with people nowadays. And that's the problem, is that if you decide or dictate what religion you follow, you'll end up worshipping yourself. You'll end up worshipping a God who's forged in your own image. So this is sort of the end result of individualism when it's applied to Christianity. Now, on the other hand, you get also a collectivist sort of Christianity that swings in the opposite end. So what this essentially involves is usually they have a moral or social code that you have to sort of submit to. And if you don't, they might practice social avoidance or shunning. So this is really common in a sort of certain Christian sects that have sort of come about through the Reformation and that sort of thing. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these collectivist Christian groups, as I said, are the spiritual children of reformers. And a lot of the reformers, when you look at it, a lot of them were lawyers. And so what happened was, during the Reformation, they wanted to move away from the authority of the church, of the Catholic Church. And so Luther came up in Protestant thought, they came up with this idea of sola scriptura. And the problem with that is a lot of lawyers were the ones who were interpreting it. So it became very black and white. You do this and you're a Christian. If you don't, you're not a Christian. And that's why a lot of, for example, the Puritans who went to America, they're considered really, severe and austere, and they just don't like to have fun because they follow this very strict code. Now, what actually shows that this isn't the right way of going about things is the fool for Christ. So who here has heard of a fool for Christ? Hands up? No? Yeah? So they're really actually fascinating. So in a book called The Freedom of Morality, Christos Yannaris writes this. So he's describing who a fool for Christ is. So he says, the fools are usually monks, and they're not always monks, so they can be women as well, who come down into the world, into the cities and into Christian societies, and perform strange and senseless actions, the actions of a madman. Yet these actions always have a deeper meaning. They aim to uncover the reality and truth hidden behind the practices of this world. So essentially, they flouted every single social convention you could think of to show that it wasn't just, the outside that made you a Christian. It was also an inward transformation. And what that meant was, it wasn't a matter of just committing to following all of these external cues that are given by a society or a Christian community. So you have to do this, you have to do that, this whole conformity. So these guys were anti-conformists, like extreme anti-conformists. So in the picture you have Saint Basil of Moscow, the holy fool. So he'd often go around naked and just pray in the streets. And we also have Saint Simeon of Emesa, Saint Xenia of St. Petersburg, Saint Macarius of Egypt, and Saint Basil, as I said. And one of the most interesting stories, and it's in that book, is that of Saint Simeon of Emesa. So he is fascinating because I think he wanted to, as being an anti-conformist, he wanted to reveal that conformity didn't mean you were a Christian. He wanted to sort of rattle the cage. So what he did was, according to the story, he went into a church when they were performing the liturgy, and he'd keep snuffing out all of the candles. And then when they tried to grab him, he went up onto the podium, up on here, and started throwing walnuts at the women. And then after that, they beat him and nearly left him for dead. So these people went to extreme lengths to show that it wasn't just because you conformed to all of these rules and regulations that made you a Christian. So having shown you guys that sort of if you go from one end to the other, they're both, extremes and they both don't work. How are we to make sense of this? Again, how are we supposed to relate to one another and to ourselves? And so with this, I want to emphasize the incarnation and theophany as being central to this. So our Orthodox faith and the Christian faith in general is one that is established upon revelation and not speculation. So when I say this, it means that we are not supposed to come up with our own sort of systems of society and then sort of move them over to Christianity. That isn't the way things work. And remember how I said that the Trinity is the social model? This is where we start to see it through Christ. So the theophany means, the manifestation or the appearance of God. And the theophany refers to the baptism of Christ. And during the baptism of Christ, you see the Trinity, you see the voice of God the Father, you hear the voice of God the Father, you see Christ incarnate, and you see the Holy Spirit as the dove. And the importance here is that, as I said, the Trinity is a hard concept to grapple with or to try and understand, but it's not something that we have made up and try to adhere to. It's something that's been revealed to us. And again, Christ is central to this. So Christ said in John, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So here we can only access the Father through Christ. And then with the Holy Spirit, he says, "The Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all things that I said to you." So it is Christ who came and sort of allowed us to perceive this Trinity. And it is true that we might have had glimpses of it in the Old Testament, but it is here, the theophany, that we actually see God in his true nature. Now, having said that, as Christians, we believe that Christ came here incarnate to bring us together. But this is where I want to take an apologetics spin. Having said that, Christ says a few or many things that are a bit very, what's the word? Oh my God, I just forgot it. Provocative, thank you. So he says these three things, I just want to focus on these. So he says, and I bet have you guys seen an icon of Christ like this before wielding a sword? You haven't? So, yeah, and this isn't modern. There are pretty old wall paintings, but this is a modern depiction of it. So Christ said, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." So that just does not make sense, right? If Christ is the King of peace, why is it that he's come to bring the sword? And then he also says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, yes, and his own life, he cannot be my disciple." So again, if God is love, why is he saying that in order to follow him, we have to hate him? It seems a bit odd, doesn't it? And then the last one as well. So he says this when there's a funeral and there's a man who wants to follow him. And then he says, and then the man says to Christ, "Can you wait? I need to bury my father." So Jesus then says to him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." So that's pretty harsh to say to a guy who's just like lost his father, right? But the thing is, this is to show that Christ came to radically change the way we think about relating to one another. He came to radically change how we think of ourselves and family and community and tribes and nations and that sort of thing. So when he says sword, that is a hyperbole, that is sort of an exaggeration, or it's a very strong metaphor to say, I have come to sever every artificial relation that you have with one another that you think represents true love. And the reason for this is, and he mentions that when he says you have to hate your mother and your father and your brother, and that you should not even have, bury your dead. The reason he says this is when you have automatic loyalty to your family who you are born in, then that can lead to family feuds. And is it just because you are related by blood to one another that you should war against another family? And then with family, you end up coming into tribes, and these tribes can war against each other, and these tribes come together as well, and they create nations, and you have nations warring against each other. So Christ came to completely destroy our notion of what it meant to relate to one another. So this idea, for example, of Aristotle, how he said that the basic political unit is the family, he came to completely shatter that. And I have stuff to back up this sort of radical interpretation. But essentially what he says is when Christ is asked, who is my mother and who is your mother, who are my brothers, this is what he says to them. He says, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my mother, my brother and sister and mother." And then when he's also talking about those who follow his gospel, he says, "Assuredly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my sake and the gospel's, who shall not receive 100-fold, now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life." So Christ isn't here just to destroy our community and just leave us for dead. He is essentially trying to radically change how we think. It's like it's being born again. We have to completely change how we relate to others. We're born into a family. We can't help that. And an interesting point about this, I mentioned it during the prosperity gospel. So this is very often used as an example of if you give God $100, you'll get 100-fold. And that is a completely incorrect interpretation. And if they saw that, you can't get 100 mothers, and who would want 100-fold persecution? That isn't something good to be promised. So this is essentially what Christ is saying. It's not, as some people would like to think, monetary reward. It's not like an investment. It's rather shows how we radically reevaluate how we relate to one another as Christians. And all of this is sort of fulfilled in the cross, in the resurrection, in the crucifixion, in the resurrection. So this is, again, a beautiful icon that sort of shows how Christ, and it reflects perfectly the verse which I'm going to read out, how Christ is both holding the hands of Adam and Eve. There is no longer animosity between man and woman, or between two human beings. So in Ephesians 2:14-18, it is written, "For he himself is our peace, has made both one, and has broken the middle wall of separation, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, and that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross. And he came and preached peace to you who are afar off and to those who are near, for through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father." So this sort of brings it all together. He not only defeated death, but he defeated sort of the artificial laws and customs that sort of divided men. And so when he mentions those who are far off and those who are near, he was referring to the Jews and the Gentiles. Here, under Christ, we are all united. And this is where I'd like to, again, emphasize the importance or the central role of the church. So this salvation is found within the church. And the communal nature of the church is both a gift and a goal. So the gift being that Christ sent the Holy Spirit in his name in order to sanctify this church. So this love and this community that we have with one another, it is God-given. It isn't something that we, work out on ourselves. Otherwise, any community could spring up with their own set of belief systems. Christ came in order to establish this church. And in this, he fulfills his promise where he said, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I'm there in the midst of them." And in this church, Christ is the head of the body, and we are the body of Christ. So again, this is to show that there's something Christianity doesn't only change the way we relate to ourselves and others, it sort of has this, it carries us towards God as well. It's not just a social ideology or something like that. It's not a social gospel. There is something substantial. There is something greater than this world. And this is like a beautiful painting by Gustav Klimt, and it sort of sums up perfectly an Orthodox saying where we say, "We are saved together, but damned alone." So sin from the very beginning was us being isolated from one another. It was us being cut off from God. It was us, it was Cain killing Abel. And here you see that death is always alone. And sin, when you look at sin and you analyze its character, it's always egocentric, it's always selfish. So the first sin was that of pride, this idea that I, a created being, Satan, could usurp God and become my own God. And whenever we sort of lust after one another, it is again this falling into egocentricity, this individualism. I deserve whatever I want. Gluttony, again, I deserve to have as much as I want. And again, this represents that, this goes to show that we ought to live as a community. That is where we find salvation. And the reason being is that, again, we are made in the image of God, and God is Trinity. So how do we live this out as Christians? So the way we do this is through the commandment of love. And this is the thing that binds us all. So when in the Old Testament it was written that you should love your neighbor as yourself, I only really recently found out what that meant. I used to think it was a bit weird because it meant, you have self-love, a narcissistic love, then you have to sort of move it on to someone else. But what it actually meant is that you have to love someone as if they are your own body. Sort of like when we talk about marriage, the two being made one flesh. And the importance here is that when Christ came, he gave us a new commandment that so he said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So again, this love isn't something that it isn't our own love that we share with others, it is Christ's love. So here we can see that we are being connected to something that goes beyond just this life, that goes beyond us, that goes beyond humanity. And to show, again, an example of what this looks like, this is a verse in Philippians, and I'll just read it out for you guys. So it says, "Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others." So again, this is a radical self-sacrificial love. And in the image you have a picture, and this love, I was going to say, is not a love that is convenient. It isn't a love that we share with others because it will make us feel good and we don't have to compromise. No, this is a love that binds us up until death. So here's an icon of the 40 martyrs of Sebaste. and they stayed together till the end, even though they were being martyred. And to give another example, in the Ladder of Divine Ascent, St. John Climacus talks about 3 monks, and their elder said, "You have done me an injustice." So you have one monk who keeps quiet because he's afraid of any punishment. The second one rejoices because he thinks, "Here is my reward, what did he say? No, he keeps quiet, and then he says, "In being quiet, here is my reward." The last one, not having even done the injustice, cries and says, I am sorry, I never meant to hurt you." So this love is a love that you do not want to ever compromise the other person, and you would rather see yourself as falling short than the other person having fallen short. So the question then becomes, doesn't this sound very collectivist? Doesn't it seem like I'm giving over myself to the body, right? Again, I'll bring up this quote, this verse, "Imitate me just as I also imitate Christ." Now, it might seem that way, but it isn't actually the case. And the reason for this is we as Orthodox believe that we work with God for our own salvation. So what this means is we are synergistic, not monergistic. And the difference is that we are God's fellow workers, and we are God's fields, and we are God's buildings. So it's funny because a building gets built, and Christ builds us as a building, and fields get sown and reaped, and that is us being sown and reaped by God. But we work with God in doing this. And what that means is there's a little bit of us in it. And to give a really good analogy by C.S. Lewis, which Sam shared with me, it's very nice, from Mere Christianity, I think, it's this idea that of salt. So each of us is like a different dish of food. We're all pretty bland without Christ, but Christ is the salt. And once you add that salt to each dish, so long as you don't overpower it, it brings out the flavor of each of those dishes, and each of them is unique in its own right. And without that salt, it sort of would be absolutely bland and tasteless. And then again, we also see this idea that we do not conform, or we do not lose our identity in the description of the body of Christ. So here's a nice, cute photo that I put up there. Yeah. So in Corinthians, again, it talks about the nature of the church. What the church actually is, the essence of the church. So in Corinthians, it is written, "For as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one another, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we all have been made to drink into one Spirit, for in fact the body is not one member, but many." So it seems paradoxical almost, but again, the analogy of the body is perfect. So although in our body we have a brain, we have a liver, we have lungs, we have kidneys, we have a stomach, each of them is unique and has its own role to play. And without the one, we could not survive. And again, we see it in the iconography of the church and just saints in general. So with iconography, a lot of the faces, if you notice, are actually modeled on the holy face of Christ. They're all meant to look the same, but each of them have their own unique characteristic. And again, Paul writes, "Are we all apostles, all prophets, teachers, workers of miracles, gifts of healings? Do we all speak tongues? Do we all interpret?" And this is to show that each of us has our own part to play in the church. So not everyone was a monk, not everyone was born a Christian. So you have people like, Saint Moses the Ethiopian. He lived a very colorful life and then became a Christian, and we venerate him for reflecting Christ in his life. And every single saint that you see around us, when you see the gold around them, that is what unites them. Although they were all unique persons, they reflected the glory of God. They lived out their own unique and special way. And if anyone is to accuse Christianity of being sort of conformist and drab and everyone has to look the same, All they have to do is look at sort of Orthodox traditions. So here I have the Coptic tradition. I think it's in the church in Jerusalem. And then you have the Armenians and the Ethiopians as well. So all you have to see is that we all express God very differently, and yet we are united. And I love the image in Revelations where it says that when John was looking into heaven, he saw a great multitude of all nations, tribes, people, and tongues standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." So even though they're all unique, they are different nations, they're all speaking in their own tongues, it is sanctified by God, and they're all using it to praise God. And this is where I want to emphasize something that is central to our Orthodox faith. And although all of this looks different, you would think, how is it that we can relate to the Ethiopians? How can we relate to the Armenians? How can we relate to the Indians and that sort of thing? And the reason being for this is Christ came to establish a church that is bound together in the Eucharist. So this is an atypical depiction of the Last Supper. And what it's meant to show is that we are all equal and surrounded. We all are equal under the cross. We are all equal when we partake in the Eucharist. And the liturgy itself, from the Greek, means the work of the people. So it isn't something that a priest can do by themselves. And the interesting thing here is you need 3 people in the liturgy in order to perform it. And this, again, is a reflection of the Trinity. We cannot do this thing by ourselves. And Christ says, so when Christ is instituting or talking about the Eucharist, this is what he says. Most assuredly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me and I in him. As the living Father sent me and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me. So we aren't just sort of connected by a set of similar beliefs. We don't just share the same dogma, and that's why we are Orthodox Christian. The reason we have this very deep communion is that we can partake in the Eucharist, and the Eucharist is what connects us all. It is what makes it more than just a social or an organization, religious organization. There's something much deeper and mystical, and it's extremely hard to explain. And as I said, this is just more to give you guys ideas and stuff to think about. So, and what this again, and this also reminds us and goes back into the prayer that Christ had for us. So in John 17, this is perhaps one of the most beautiful passages in Scripture. So this is where Christ personally prays for all of creation, or all of humanity. And this, again, you will see a glimpse of the Trinity, and it seems very, it's very hard to pin down. It seems all over the place, but that's the point. It's a mystery. So in this prayer, Christ says that they all may be one. So he's praying that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that they may be one just as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. So Christ came and was incarnate for us so that we may have access to the Trinity. Our salvation, being found in community, is to regain communion with the Trinity, with God. And so I'd like to end on this, and it's a really chunky quote. I didn't have time to cut it, I'm sorry. So this is from the Orthodox Way, and Callistus Ware sums it up beautifully. So what he says is that the most helpful way of entry into the divine mystery of the Trinity are to affirm that God is personal and that God is love. Now, both these notions imply sharing and reciprocity. First, a person is not all the same as an individual. Isolated, self-dependent, none of us is an authentic person but merely an individual. Egocentricity is the death of the true personhood. Each becomes a real person only through entering into relation with other persons, through living for them and in them. There can be no man, so it has been rightly said, until there are at least two men in communication. The same is true, secondly, of love. Love cannot exist in isolation, but presupposes the other. Self-love is the negation of love. And this icon is perhaps, the Russians might not have been like the Greeks, they might not have been theologians or very philosophical, but they preach the gospel through images, through iconography. And this is perhaps like one of the best images to show the concept of the Trinity and how it is we enter. So I'd just like to end by describing what it is, because I absolutely love it. So in it you see, it's called the hospitality of Abraham, and this is sort of foreshadowing the Trinity. So it's supposed to depict the visitation where you had those three men come to Abraham and eat. So on the right, on your left-hand side, you have in the pink and the red, the Holy Spirit, and then on the right, you have God the Father. The reason it's okay to depict him like this is it's because you're not painting God the Father as a man, in a white robe and that sort of thing. It's conceptual. So the thing is, if you look in the center, then you have Christ. So you have the red showing his humanity and the blue showing his divinity. And if you notice, his clothing is a lot more opaque than the others. This shows that he became man, he was incarnate, he came in the flesh. And that's the reason he's facing you. And on his shoulder, you see the stole, which is representative of the priesthood. And what is amazing as well is that if you see the shape that the God the Father and God the Holy Spirit make, it makes a chalice around against the God the Son. And in front of him, you see the sacrificial lamb. And then if you look at the podium that they're standing on, it's actually pointing out towards you. So it's an inverted perspective. And the whole point of this was that when you are meant to go up to this icon, you're supposed to become you're supposed to enter that table, and you're supposed to enter communion with the Trinity. And I guess, yeah, I had to look all of that up, but it's absolutely amazing what you can get from just icons. But with that, I guess I'd like to end it. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert, for that beautiful talk in many ways, visually beautiful, and the ideas were beautiful, and so on. I love this idea, this theme in Christianity of paradox. You always come across it everywhere. So the answer to the question, are we individuals or a community, is yes. I love that. I will say, though, I think we will be having some deacons stand at the door of the church every Sunday to check everyone's pockets for walnuts. You've got me a little bit worried now. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments or discussions you'd like to have with Albert, we're doing that system where there's a microphone over there, so please come to the front. If someone's already there, you can just sort of come and sit behind them or something, and that sort of keeps the discussion a little bit organised. So would anyone like to kick off with the first question? Or maybe while you're thinking of a question and moving to the front, can I ask a question? So do please come forward. Can you take us back to something like the third or the fourth slide, I think, where you had the list of characteristics of a cult? If you remember, I think there were 4 of them. Mm-hmm. And I'd just like to... That's the one, yeah. Can you... I mean, that's, I think, what people outside the church sometimes accuse the church of being. What are your thoughts? How would you respond to that? I suppose we can't speak for other churches, but just within our Coptic church at least. How would you respond to that accusation?
So just as Abuna said, it's sort of a paradox, and because we're only human, although this idea of collectivism or individualism is bad, it's a false dichotomy. We as humans and as a human organisation or institution tend to go from one side to the other. So a lot of the time, of course, in our church, we have people who are on the fringes and they don't, they're not proper, they don't follow all the rules and they're sort of shunned. So this is, of course, something that isn't supposed to happen. And the thing is, the church is a hospital where we all come to be healed. It's a place where we're all sinners. And so that's the problem. A lot of the time, we're not perfect, and a lot of the time, we sort of succumb to this worldly thinking. It's very neat and tidy to say, black and white. You have to either follow this or you're out, or, if you don't believe this or think the same way, you are not a Christian. But of course, this isn't the way things are. And I guess Christ, when he says, do not look at the speck in your brother's eye, when you have the plank in your own, the point of Christianity is although we are saved together, we have to look at ourselves and we have to fast and pray and transform ourselves. Our concern isn't the transformation of others. We are not the Messiah. So, is that good?
Are you all just shy? Would you like to ask questions from the floor? If you're welcome to if you don't want to come to the microphone, just maybe raise a hand and ask a question or make a comment. Go for it.
Would you say culture within any organization, within our society, or in our church setting, would you say, for example, the Egyptian culture can be perceived as a mode of collectivism? And how do we challenge that? How does that get challenged? Is that a concern?
Well, so are you saying that as in Egyptian modern culture, we're sort of collectivist in that everyone has to gossip and speak like
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 if you're not thinking like an Egyptian, if you're not behaving like an Egyptian, if you're not conforming to the way we conform and relate to each other, then you're an outcast of some sort. You may not belong to this particular expression of Christianity.
Okay. Well, yeah, so that's the problem. Again, as I mentioned when I was talking about like distinctly sort of ethnic expressions or cultural expressions of Christianity, sort of the bad side of that is that if you're an Egyptian and you don't conform to Egyptianness, you're sort of an outcast. But I think the whole point is that, as Paul said in Galatians, there is neither Greek nor Jew or that sort of. So the Russianness or the Greekness isn't the point. You don't have to be a Coptic in order to be Orthodox. You don't have to be Russian to be Orthodox. And so this idea that you have to sort of commit to a certain culture in order to be a Christian is sort of false. Is that sort of what you're saying? Yeah. So I guess...
What I'm saying is, does culture pose a threat of Christianity in such a way that it can come across as collectivism?
Yeah.
When in reality it's actually community.
Yeah. So I was speaking to a Greek Orthodox priest and I actually said that, and I was asking, can culture be a bad thing at times? And what he offered like a interesting spin on it. He said a lot of the time individuals sort of leave the church, and leaving the church you'd think that they'd lose a sense of community, but because they belong to a particular culture, they can somehow reach the church. They still are on the fringes. And I think for us, as like a lot of us are first generation, Egyptians, it's really hard to we're sort of in the middle of things like, are we Australian, are we Egyptian, where is it that we stand? So I think I don't know, it's sort of trying to hold on to the tenets of Christianity and not to succumb to the sort of like worldliness. So either I have to be an individual or I have to conform and become part of like what is essentially a cult, that sort of thing. And the thing is, it's like the Trinity with the personhood and the community. You're a person in as much as you are unique, but you cannot be cut off from others, and you are part of a community, but you cannot lose yourself in it. So it's really hard. It's like a paradox. You either seem to swing to each direction or not know where to go. So it seems very vague, but did I touch on it at all? Yeah. Can you offer something? Sure.
I'm losing my voice, you won't be able to hear me otherwise. I think maybe what Michael, or if I can put what Michael said in other words, in our church we sometimes think of our church as a collective rather than a community. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it? And that's a really, sorry, that's a very important point for us to take note of, so that we don't fall into that hole and we don't end up looking like that. Not the pink, I mean, I'm a bit jealous of the pink, but the four things at the side there. Because I looked at that and I thought, sometimes we kind of do that in our church, don't we? There are times when that happens. There are times when, if you think a particular way, we have this thing called aib. I don't know how you translate aib into English. Shame or something like that. And we try and kind of corral people through shame. Okay, if you don't behave the right way. That's not to say that we shouldn't, have the right beliefs and live a moral life and, have a hierarchy of love and all those things. But I think that's just the wrong way to go about achieving it. It's not the goals that are wrong, it's the way that we go about achieving it that's maybe wrong. Or what do you think, Albert?
You said it. Yeah, I don't need to add anything to that.
Okay, next question.
But on the flip side, isn't Christianity prescriptive a lot in a lot of the stuff that it says? Like, we have a certain set of beliefs that are core beliefs, and then there are certain other things that are open to interpretation. So in a sense, there is a bit of it's kind of like the individual, but within the community. So in the sense, the church kind of just does have things where you kind of have to agree with this, or you're not a part of it. And that's like fair enough, you know what I mean? Like any club you have to be, or a community, you have to have some sort of common thing that you share. But isn't some of that like taking away from the individualism as well? Say for example, like I'm an individual and I grow up in a certain society, and I get influenced by that society, and then I kind of come to my own, basically, obviously you come to your own beliefs, but through the influences of society. But say for example, growing up in a certain area, I've come to the belief, for example, that homosexuality is not a sin, for example, but that is against a certain code of ethics or morality, for example. So there is some kind of, surely there has to be some sort of barrier of when Christianity kind of becomes, like you can't have pure liberalism in terms of everyone can believe whatever they want, but then you can't have total dictatorship where you have to believe X, and if you don't believe X, you're not a part of it. So don't you think, like in a sense, is it basically like a spectrum? That's my question. Is basically, is it kind of like a spectrum where it's total conformity and then total liberalism, and then you're kind of in between, or is it a different, like how would you kind of graph it? Basically, that's what I'm trying to visualize how this works, because there's a lot of beautiful iconography, but I'm just trying to visualize how the individual functions as a member of the community. I think maybe the best illustration was the body, the organs and the thing like that, but maybe you can elaborate on that. Sorry for the convoluted question.
It's okay. So there was a really interesting podcast that I listened to. It was called The Tragedy of Dogma. So essentially he was a philosophy professor, a convert to orthodoxy, and he said that dogma was essentially a bad thing, because what it meant is that people started going astray. And so dogma became this thing to sort of like in a bowling alley to set up bumpers so you don't go off course. And dogma is there not so we can sort of believe this thing that some philosopher or theologian has come up with, and if we don't conform to that, then we're on the fringes. As I mentioned, Christianity is the faith is built upon revelation, not speculation. So when we say you have to believe these certain things, it's because we as Christians believe in a spiritual reality that is objective. You know, there is one God, not many. This God is Trinity. Christ is both man and God. So we have to confess that faith. We have to preach that faith. What goes wrong is when people who start disagreeing with that start being persecuted and being burnt as heretics, because Christ, being God incarnate, spoke to people directly, and yet people refused him. So it is not for us to sort of cause people to conform to the way we think, because if we do, then we don't think that truth can speak for itself, that it's something man-made, that it has to be enforced. You know, for example, you can't sort of kill people if they insult God or that sort of thing, because God does not need defending. He's not a tribal leader whose honor, you have to defend. So does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably easier to understand from the dogma perspective. The thing that I'm interested in is the moral perspective.
The moral. So I think, so all of those fools for Christ, for example, they would always hang out in brothels with prostitutes and that sort of thing, but they never engaged in the sexual immorality. And sin, we wouldn't call sin as a sort of betrayal, or you're not going against an ethical system that we've written up. You are betraying your nature, your very nature. So when people sin, for example, fornicate, they kill, they do this and that, it is not for us to enforce and say you have to fall in line and do this. We cannot change the hearts of people. They have to do it themselves. As I said, our salvation is synergistic. We have to play a part, and then God has to play a part. So again, sin isn't this ethical system that you have to follow, otherwise you're bad. It's a matter of life or death. Either you're living a holy and good life, and God can see that, with the case of the holy fools, or you could be living with a facade. You can appear all prim and proper, but you could be, as the Pharisees, the whitewashed tombs. So again, it is not for us to enforce a certain moral code, because we cannot know what is behind, what their hearts are really like. So does that it is not for us to enforce that sort of thing.
So, but like we were saying, is there is an objective moral code, and the point is that we don't know, we're not in a position to judge whether what someone did is against or is not against, because in the end of the day it comes to the intentions and or it comes to the motives and spirituality behind it. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
because I'm sure it's happened to you and to me as well, and to all of us. We've judged someone too harshly very quickly because they've acted out of line. They've done something that seemed why did you do that? But behind it you see that they had very noble intentions and that they did that for a reason. And this is the whole idea of Christ coming to fulfill the law, not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. He came to sort of supersede that sort of Pharisaical, you have to do this, you can't eat shellfish, you can't do that. But you do still need to live. I mean, you can't be pure and then live a sexually immoral life. That just doesn't happen. But so, yeah.
Is it maybe like an analogy of not like a prison maybe, but is it maybe like an analogy of say you've got say for example you set up a city or a suburb, and then the city and the suburb, the structure of that's the kind of the barriers of the religion, and then within that you're free to do what you like, express yourself in an individualistic kind of way within that. Is that a reasonable analogy?
No, because for example, Saint Augustine said a sinner who thinks that they are free, they're not enslaved to God or to any master. They're in fact enslaved to their sin, to their passions. And in that way, you're not really free. So Christos Yannaros wrote the book, The Freedom of Morality. And it's like the example, I think an analogy that Abuna Antonius gave me a long time ago when you're doing Coptic studies, I think. He's it's sort of like a violin. So you have the strings of a violin, and if the strings are not attached to the violin, it sort of can't produce anything, it can't make anything of worth. Once you tighten it and attach it to the violin's body, even though it seems restricted in its movement, it can actually fulfill its role. So it's not a matter of restrictions, like the morality being restrictive. If anything, it's what's allowing us to live a more fulfilling life. It's what allows us to be fully human. As I said, sin is what leads to death because it's always inherently egotistical, egocentric, and that sort of thing. So rather than being a boundary or something, it actually allows us to live as we ought to live. So, and that's the thing. If you choose, for example, to sin, our orthodox conception of hell, or sort of an idea, but I think Saint Isaac the Syrian, is that you are in self-imposed self-isolation. It's not God who says you're punished because you betrayed my law. It's something you have chosen yourself. So, does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. Thanks.
I just wanted to say the final image that you used of the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you say it was okay to depict it like that?
Okay, so I think I'm not a professional when it comes to this sort of stuff, but the whole point is it's not, the intention isn't to depict the Trinity as it is seen, and the reason it's okay is when you look at God the Father and the Holy Spirit, they appear ethereal, so it is only the central figure. It's really subtle, and it might be pushing it, but the central figure is the one who's wearing opaque clothing, and the reason for that is that central figure is Christ incarnate, so he came in the flesh, whereas the reason it looks very like, transparent and ghostly is because those two aren't they never became incarnate. So rather than this being sort of an improper depiction of the Trinity, it confirms like the reality of the incarnation, that Christ in fact became man. So yeah, is that okay?
Hey, just a question. I came a little bit late, so sorry if you've answered this, but can our church, in its community and in its beautiful things that you discussed, be a preventative thing for, or like a barrier to entry for others outside the church, thinking of becoming
a barrier
Christian?
for what?
A barrier to entry, like can it be a preventative thing to entering the church, and if so, what does the church do, or what can it do to kind of make them feel inclusive or included in that community or in that body that you were discussing before?
So what exactly is preventative? Sorry.
No, I'm saying can the collectiveness and all of that be a preventative thing for others to enter into the community of the Christian church?
Well, yeah, it's sort of like what Abuna and Michael were trying to touch upon, like the whole idea that you have to act a particular way, and it's if you do a particular thing, and a lot of people, Egyptians, have left the church because they've felt out of touch with the culture. So I can't even begin to imagine how a convert would feel. So like sometimes they might feel sort of isolated, lonely. They might not feel like they can relate because of this idea that you have to conform, you have to do this. And I guess, as I said, like the church is a hospital, we're all human. The whole point is to be aware of this and to try and not fall into this trap of being too judgmental or saying that you have to conform to the way we do things, the way we see things. So like it's just something that each of us has to take initiative for. So yeah.
In regards to culture and collectivism, I think that the culture, which I think I've already stressed, might be acting a bit more like collectivism, is that's how it is. That's the problem, and that's what, like Robert said, could be a barrier how it should be, shouldn't be a barrier, because it's not collectivism, it's not individualism, it's a weird amalgamation of
And just the problem is the fact that we belong to any sort of organization means this organization has a certain vision or identity, and then we're more likely to swing towards, conforming and that collectivism rather than individualism. So that's a reality that we have to sort of like fight against, I guess.
Yeah, all right, so this is still a forming thought, so if it doesn't make sense, just let me clarify. But all right, so I want to go back to what Abraham said about how exactly we should think about individuals coming to, like, having a place in a community, right? How exactly does an individual fit into a community without having their individuality erased? So, like, the answer that I like is to say something like, a community works best when all the members have an authentic relationship to the things the community believes. So that means that they believe the dogma and they follow the morals, not because they were pressured to or because they were told to, but because they genuinely see the reasonableness of them and they actually want to, right? And that's actually better for the community. You avoid all of those four problems, the persecution and so on. So if that's what communities actually want, at the same time you have this problem because communities tend to just naturally stifle that kind of authenticity, because there's this temptation to apply pressure to people who sort of, move out of the boundaries. So like the typical example we always talk about is, we have people who have had bad experiences in Sunday school because they asked a question and the Sunday school teacher said, you can't ask that, Like that's an example of like stifling authenticity in the way that I'm talking about. So my question is, what can communities do, or what should communities do, and like think especially of ours, in order to, not lose their morals and dogma and other things that make them a community, but also not to stifle authenticity, to keep members authentic in their membership. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I'll let you answer. Okay, I'll just give a tiny but I think, like, personally for me as well, is when I began to understand, as you said, when I started to have an authentic understanding and appreciation for what it is I actually believed, when it stopped being this thing that I was taught in Sunday school, when it stopped being this thing that I was just brought up in because I'm Coptic Orthodox, then I started seeing that it wasn't for me to sort of enforce it or impose it on others. So I think the whole point, a lot of it would be just education. So to teach kids for this transitionary period between like kids just being okay with like that Sunday school answer to being thinking adults, they need to have something that's sort of like satisfying to grapple with, something that is authentic, that is mature. Otherwise they'll remain with this whole idea because God said so, and that is the way they'll interact with others. That's how I see it. But on a practical level, like at a pastoral level, I want to answer that one. Yeah.
I think we've actually come quite a long way. Certainly in the time that I've been in the service. I was just thinking as Albert was speaking that I remember in my first year of priesthood having a father at our parish bring along his teenage son and telling me that he's gone over to the devil and that I have to talk to him really, really seriously and I have to stop him from his evil deed. What was the evil deed? He wanted to go to the barber and shave the side of his head a little bit shorter than the top of his head. Okay? And because that was a cultural thing. They were kind of a new immigrant family, and I think they were from Upper Egypt, I'm not quite sure. I'm from Upper Egypt, by the way, so I'm not saying anything, demeaning or anything. And it was like, you can't do that. Okay, you can't. Today, I think, I think half of you guys, wouldn't be allowed in church today because you do all sorts of weird things with your hair, and some of you put things in your ears and noses and, all that sort of stuff. But to me, I see that as a little bit of progress. I think what that says to me is not that our moral standards are becoming lower or anything like that. I think to me, it's exactly what Albert's been saying today. We've kind of realize that we don't have to conform in those external things. We don't all have to look the same. You know, you don't have to look like Saint Mary to be a holy person. You can actually look like a holy fool. Or, you know, I remember actually seeing in a church in Egypt a guy who had a ponytail. This is again like 30 years ago or something. And I remember, you know, the person taking me through having to stop and explain to me why this guy had a ponytail. As if it was a horrible thing that there's this guy in the church courtyard who has a ponytail. But it's okay because he's actually probably one of, you know, a saint, and he comes and he scrubs the floors of the church and things like this. So, you know, and that's why we accept him. He's weird and he's bad and he looks like a, you know, immoral person. But we accept him because he comes and does nice things, kind of thing. And maybe he's a little bit crazy and he needs psychiatric help. And we don't think that way. So I think there's hope. I think it's, you know, there is progress, definitely. But to come back to your question, which is a roundabout way to get back to it, here's a weird and crazy idea. I'm not saying we should do this, but I'm just floating it as a thought, okay? Imagine if at least some of our Sunday school time was not given to delivering a lesson, but to encouraging people to search for themselves and to find the answers themselves. Rather than giving them the answers, to actually teach them the skill and the art of finding truth. I think a lot of people would probably not be very comfortable with that idea, because let's be honest, you will probably lose some people if you do that. Okay? And I think that's what people would be afraid of. What if they come to the wrong answers? What if they come to answers, you know, and doubt their faith in the end? And that's, you know, that's a very real danger. But on the other hand, those who don't, those who find the right answers, I think are much more ready to be authentic Christians and like sincere believers in the community because they've come to those answers themselves. And I suppose in the end it's going to come down to what you think the nature of Christian truth is. If you think that it's actually in the same league as the laws of gravity and the logic of mathematics, that it's just the truth at the heart of reality, then you probably wouldn't be that scared because, you know, nobody by going off on their own tangent comes to the conclusion that 2 + 2 is 5, or that they can fly, you know, without an aeroplane or anything, they can just float into the air. Nobody comes to that conclusion because there's a reality there. If you think that Christian truth is just part of that reality, you probably would be more willing to do this. If you think, on the other hand, if somewhere subconsciously you have a fear that that may not be the case, you have a fear that maybe if they think too much about it, they'll find faults in it because there are faults in it, then I think you'd be much more worried and anxious. So I don't know, I'm just floating that idea. I don't know if you know, I think your question was, you know, what can we do? So that's maybe one idea. I suppose that's the very dangerous experiment that Aletheia apologetics is, isn't it? Because we're running that risk. We're raising all these really dangerous questions and encouraging everyone who comes to think about them. And some of you may come to what the church would say is the wrong answer. That's probably true. But I think, to me, I see Christian truth as being part of reality, so I'm not that worried about it. But I don't know. Feel free to disagree with me. I might be totally on the wrong track here.
So essentially what you're saying is we should teach philosophy. Because the interesting point as well is the fathers thought that philosophy was the teaching tool of the Greeks, whereas the law was the teaching tool of the Jews. And when St. Paul went to Mars Hill, they had a temple to the one God, and it's they came to that conclusion themselves. So I think the whole point is if you earnestly want to seek truth, God created the universe, you will find that truth somewhere. Cool.
While I agree with you, Father, on the point that to train or to encourage people to come to their own way of thinking. And I, personally, in my life, when people have a particular way of thinking, I try and probe into the underlying reason why they've come to that conclusion, and maybe challenge the initial thing that triggered this rather than what they initially said, which is something that takes time and takes a lot of effort and so forth. One of the dangers is, and we're thinking out loud here, one of the dangers that I think is that it broadens, it opens up the opportunity for people to come to an understanding of God or what we would call doctrines or dogmas that are non-negotiable to how we, in isolation from the community. And that's one of the things where, look, I might get to your conclusion, maybe one day, maybe not, maybe never, or maybe I will, but it may not necessarily be that I will result in a communal and personhood mentality. I will still have an individual and maybe thinking about community down the track then. So, I don't know, I'm just thinking, I think the church still has a responsibility in somehow to state that this is how we see the Christian worldview and how we see what we call reality, and then let the person come to see if how he's thinking and wherever he gets to a point marries with that or not. And I think that's what's really important, is touching on Abraham's question, is the mentality of, and I think this has been a fault of our system for a long time, where we have separated dogma and morals too much. So the dogma is truth, pure, unadulterated. It's a revelation from God, as we would put it. But our behavior and so forth can not necessarily reflect that dogma. And so we've got the truth, but I know I'm not perfect, and I can't meet those two, and they can't marry in my world, in my way of thinking. And I think that dichotomy or that separation is dangerous for us to separate. If you honestly believe that this is the truth, then in one way or the other, at least you're striving to adhere to that reality. Or else it's just, it's like a creed or a definition that has no personal effect on you.
Yeah, look, I think that second point you make is a really, really important one, that connection between what you do and how you live and what you believe and how you worship. Like they should all be one. But on the first point, thank you for pointing that out. So I think you're right. It would be very dangerous to just tell people, well, we're not going to tell you anything in Sunday school. We want you to work everything out by yourself. That's, of course, that's not the way to do it. But I think every good teacher knows that there's an art to equipping the person, giving them the skills and giving them the resources that they need, and making it easier for them, and maybe modelling for them how to go about doing it. Being there when they don't know what the next step is, but rather than prescribing and telling them this is what you do, making gentle suggestions that just nudge them in the right direction, kind of thing. So it's a guided learning, I suppose. But thank you, that's a good thing to point out. Yeah.
The other thing that the word is on, it's very it's very it's going to take a lot of equipping for us to get to a stage where we are dealing with people on that level, or within the educational system of the church, to rather than be telling them what to believe, rather than getting them to come to that conclusion with a gentle. So yourself, you can do that. So a lot of people may not be able to have that flexibility.
Yeah. No, it's true, yeah. And a lot of people may not want to either.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people who just say, just give me the answer.
No, a lot of people have been taught, this is what I was told, and this is what I have to deliver, and to them that's their faithfulness to the faith. Just deliver what has been passed down to you. Let's not leave too much room for people to go astray.
Yeah.
They're your responsibility.
Okay. Did you want to comment before we go to the next? Right? Yeah.
To answer my question as well, at that point, I said as well, I wasn't separating dogma and morals in terms of like practicality. I'm just saying in terms of identity, there are different things. Dogma is not moral. There are different aspects of it. So, like dogma is, when we're talking about dogma, we're talking about like the fundamental truths of Christianity, and morals genuine in what they believe because they've come to that conclusion based on reasons that it could be, basically, intellectual reasons, emotional reasons, or whatever. The issue is, I think, a lot of people would agree with Abuna, for example, the fact that Christianity is true in the sense that of mathematics and, in the sense that it's totally rigorous in 100%. But what they might disagree with is they'll say, for example, while Christianity is 100% true in a rigorous mathematical scientific sense of the word, it might not always appear to be true, or people might be motivated by other factors other than going straight for the truth. For example, like in the years that we're teaching Sunday school, someone's going through the adolescent life, and they've got multiple, in just wanting to be cool, wanting to be accepted in school might be a more powerful motivator for that person to follow a certain ideology than to be a person who's looking rigorously after the truth. So I think it's something that is probably maybe worthwhile introducing maybe later on when people are developing their own, basically they're developing their own thought systems and building themselves more as individuals in their thought processes as well.
Yeah, good points. Would you like to comment on that?
I guess the whole point of the Christian truth is being orthodox. We'd say, the faith was given to the apostles, handed down to us. And although it doesn't change in its essence and that it's the truth, it might change in the way we express it from time to time, so it's understandable to others. And I agree with Abuna, and I don't think you're saying we should just leave them to their own devices. They should always, of course, we should always have them little guidance. But I'm speaking from personal experience. For me, it was all just do this, do that. It was all really Sunday school answers, and it was only when I read philosophy and it shook my worldview that and then I found how empty it was. I started moving back into theology and religion and Christianity and that sort of thing. So I think it's a case you have to sort of test the maturity of the person. Not everyone's a theologian. Not everyone's sort of got that simple faith. So you have to play it by ear, so to speak. Yeah.
That's a good point. Okay, are there any other questions?
Can I hazard one more question? The other thing I wanted to talk about was the definition of the community. I think we've been using the community loosely tonight to mean Coptic Orthodox, or maybe even a little bit broader in terms of Christian. So what's our perspective of being in part of the community in a wider sense, not just Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy, maybe all of Christianity in general, or all of humanity, for example. What's your perspective on seeing community in that greater sense?
Well, I guess every single human being was made in the image of God, so in that way we can relate to one another. In a sense, we still have closed communion in that we can't just let anyone who's not baptized, partake in the Eucharist, and in that way we seem exclusive. But I think the point that Christ made about loving your enemy and blessing those who persecute you, this love isn't something that we just have for one another. The church isn't that family that Christ tried to destroy for us so that we could become the church. It's not we only have loyalty to those in the church. We still have to love one another. And I think one of the best examples is when I think Julian, the emperor, they call him Julian the Apostate because he was Christian, then he became pagan again. He wrote a letter and he was complaining about how the Christians were feeding not only their poor but also the poor of the pagans. And so this community, although we relate as Coptic Orthodox, as Egyptians, and then we also relate as Christianity on a whole, we can relate to one another as human beings because we are all made in the image of God. So again, we all yearn for that community, we all yearn for belonging. So that's how I'd see it.
But I just realized, from kind of Michael's point, but intellectual authenticity isn't the only kind of authenticity. It just struck me that that's actually really important. So something like that, right, where you sort of let people go and find their own conclusions. As you were saying, that may not work for everyone, right? Because that may not be the kind of, intellectual discipline might not be the thing that makes someone authentic. It might be more sort of like moral discipline, right? Moral authenticity. So that the thing to do is not to sort of make them go and learn research skills. It's to go and learn how to sort of like genuinely be convinced of the importance of service and things like that. But it just strikes me that that's really important because, those kinds of ways of preserving authenticity are much less threatening to dogma, right? You don't need to, some people are content to just say, yeah, I'll believe what the theologians say, but then in terms of action, authenticity is much more important. It's just a comment because, your point brought it out.
Bram, are you satisfied with my answers? Okay. Yeah, or it's okay.
Just to go on from what Samuel's saying, I think, going back to like Sunday school and how it could be improved, I think practical lessons are really, really important. So it's not just a matter of, you have to have written down a lesson and come and tell a story and stuff like that. But sometimes actually going to visit a nursing home or going to clean the toilets as a group, and then that teaches you what it means to be part of a community, and it teaches you what it means to be alive through relationship with others by making a difference in their life, and then the difference that makes in your life in return. So I think that's the kind of thing you're saying as well, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So do we have any other questions? Well, good. I don't see any hands. Okay. Well, I think we might call it a night. Thank you very much, Albert, for a fascinating night. Very interesting.